I'm endlessly fascinated and curious about the world around us, about business, about politics, about the arts, about culture, developments, social issues, and the people. Most importantly, about the people that are shaping our future. Every night, I get the opportunity to have conversations, to dive into conversations with thought leaders, with change makers, entrepreneurs, politicians, and everyday heroes who unpack the ideas and stories that I think matter to all of us. What's the future of our economy? What's the future of our country? How do we build stronger communities? What can we learn from music, theater, sports, politics, the arts? How does policy shape our real lives? What does leadership look like, real leadership in today's environment? If it's interesting and relevant and topical and we're talking about it, you'll hear about it here at 6 o'clock on the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I want to have real conversations, in-depth conversations. These are ideas we're sharing. This is the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. Thanks for joining me. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've got an incredible privilege tonight to introduce you all again to David Peterson. David Peterson is the former premier of the province of Ontario. 40 years ago, this year, he became elected as the 20th premier of Ontario. It ended 42 years of Tory dynasty. And I'm not sure if you know this, David, but the premier before you was my great uncle, Harry Nixon. And so I feel like I've got a real connection because my great uncle was the premier during 43 and 44. And then I had the privilege of being David Peterson's youth chairman during his leadership campaign, and was very happy when he got elected as Premier of Ontario. And we're going to talk a little bit tonight about you.
Hang on, before you start into that, Crombie, I just want to tell you, I knew you had royal blood. Bob Nixon brags all the time about the Crombie relationship, which is you. And number two, I will say now, and I'll say publicly, but this is publicly, I probably would not have won that leadership without your help. You were this fresh-faced, aggressive, fun, loud, noisy, smart, charismatic young guy who organized all the youth, and we won that leadership convention. So I still owe you.
Well, it was an honor working for you, sir, and I was very happy when you became leader, and then ultimately when you became premier. And that was 40 years ago this year. And you know, we've got a.
You didn't even shave then.
I didn't. You're right. We've got a leadership review coming up. We've got a convention. I want to talk about how you're going to vote and what you think about that. But I did want to talk a little bit about what you think makes a good leader. You were an incredibly good leader. Tell me, in retrospect, in history, and you've had the opportunity of working with, prime ministers and other premiers and lots of business people. What do you think are the qualities that makes a good leader, sir?
Brian, it's a very, very good question. It's been written about by the best in the business schools and political life, and what's Winston Churchill got, and what about FDR, and why this, and why some succeed and some don't. And because there's very different qualities that people respond to. I think the most important thing of a leader, you have to have followers. Now, the question is, how do you generate followers, and how do you work with people? I could, I could give a long speech on this, Brian. I think the first thing you have to do, and there's many, many, many different aspects of leadership, and many different kinds of leaders. And I don't think there's one size fits all, because there's leadership in all walks of life. Political leadership, that's one type. Business leadership, intellectual leadership, artistic leadership. But I would say having a fairly, at least in political terms, having a good center of gravity. When I say that, being on top of your own psyche, and not being needy, and understanding that leadership by and large is about service, and you have to think about the people around you all of the time. These people that present that it's all about them all of the time don't always, and of course Trump's an exception to that. And so it just shows that there's exceptions to everything I'm going to say. But I think great leadership is about other people. It's about listening and being centered. Now, after that, you need a lot of skills, and I think you need integrity matters. But again, Brian, I'm saying all this, and you look south of the border, everything I say, the opposite is there. So I guess I have a traditional view of leadership. You look at a guy like Mark Carney, and I would say he fits my traditional view of what leaders are and should be. Very bright man, highly centered, sensitive. He's not an egomaniac. He knows what he's doing, and having clear, articulated views and vision to bring people along is important. So that's where you start in leadership, anyway. And
Were you always a great leader? Were there people that you looked up to? Were there people you sort of tried to emulate? How did you gain your leadership skills?
I am my life, Brian, was is completely serendipitous. I didn't plan anything. I had stumbled into politics as I ended up meeting my wife and married her 2.5 months later. I didn't plan anything. I didn't plan to run. I ran and won. And then I very quickly after that ended up in the first leadership. I lost that. And I don't know. Somebody came up to me after the first caucus meeting when Bob Nixon resigned. You'll recall that. And said, are you going to run for leader? And I said, I haven't even found the washroom in Queen's Park. How could I run for leader? Anyway, I ended up running for leader, and I didn't win. I lost to Stuart Smith. So this, I didn't plan anything. I think you absorb these things along the way. Now, I was always a big reader. I always was up on the news when I was a little kid. I was involved in student politics when I was at Western and again in ways at University of Toronto uh, at law school. And I cared about things, but I didn't deliberately go out and say, what are the skills of a great leader? How can I emulate those? But I'll tell you the one thing, a story I will tell you, though, Brian. My generation of politics was a long time ago, as you have said. And the biggest single influence on my life was John Kennedy. It's interesting. I have sat and talked to a lot of successful politicians of my generation. I'll use as an example Bill Clinton. I knew Bill Clinton when he was governor of Arkansas before he became president. I ended up at various events with him, and we'd end up on the stage together. And he was a brilliant guy for all of his sins, brilliant and very charismatic. He just radiated body heat. But sitting up late at night and having a glass of brandy, you say, why are you in politics? What are the things that inspired you? A lot of that generation referred back to the speech of Kennedy, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. I grew up in a very uplifting age, and I was the sort of the hippies in the 60s. And it was about love, and it wasn't about war. It was about kindness. Those were a lot of the dominant forces. We weren't into the forces of pure greed that sort of prevailed in the marketplace and the new conservative movement. It was about service and helping other people. It was about the people that I hung out with were people who went to the Peace Corps and were giving their lives to trying to make the world a better place. And so there's a hefty dose of idealism in this. And I think we could discuss whether idealism has died or not in this country or in other countries. The idealism of believing you can make a difference and wanting to make a difference. And it's a very powerful fuel. in a person's life if they have some element of idealism.
Thank you. I appreciate that. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back. And I'm going to ask a little bit more after the break about how you think politics has changed. How have leaders changed? And is this just a momentary trend, or is it something that is sort of a long-term trend? Stay with us, everyone. We're chatting with David Peterson, 40 years after he last got elected as Premier of Ontario. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've got David Peterson, the 20th Premier of Ontario, with us tonight. 40 years ago, he was elected as Premier of Ontario. David, you talked a little bit about leadership and your own style of leadership, but then you also addressed how you think politics and leadership has changed. I ended up having dinner this weekend with someone who said that they messed up for like 50 years. They thought that ethics and doing what was right and all this kind of stuff. And I hope they were just being sort of provocative. But he said, no, you know what? I've come to the realization, given what's happening right now, is that it's greed. It's about graft, about trying to get your advantage for your own family, your own business that's successful in politics today. Obviously, pointing south of the border. What do you think? Has politics changed dramatically? Are we into this world where it's so partisan and so to my own benefit, and everything you talked about in regards to service and idealism, that's bygone. That's nice things from 1970 and 1980.
You are raising the most profound questions of our age because very definitely it has changed. And is it all about greed? I don't think so. The problem is that Trump has upset the model of everything everyone of value or honor believed in. And look, let's accept the fact that people like Trump come along once in a while. I can understand that. But the fact that he has any followers at all is something that I have a hard time understanding. Is it because people have been tramped on, because he liberates them? Is it because he is rich or a celebrity? I think we're in an age of celebrity, Brian, and there's a lot of people who want to take a shortcut to fame and fortune by just being famous for doing something. And a lot of times those things are not very admirable. It's this craving for attention. Now, why is that? Is it the age? It's the age of what? Social media. When I grew up, there were no computers were just starting. I mean, there were no cell phones. There was a different way of communicating. Television was in its heyday. Screens dominated. News was curated. In other words, we didn't have all this people making up their own truth and just peddling it on whatever airwave or media they could find. And now there's just so much confusion in the air. The breakdown of all conventional methods of distribution and curating news. And some people just find it very hard to know who to believe and how to believe them. I think Trump, to his credit, if that's the right word, understands this. Actually, and I think the worst contributor to the modern world is Rupert Murdoch. Rupert Murdoch disaggregated media, conventional media. He, in a sense, took cable news and turned it into partisan, selling sex, violence, and right-wing extremism. I think without philosophy, without regard to truth or merit, based purely on the idea that it would sell. The tragedy is it does sell. And the tragedy is he has not been totally wrong. And in many ways, Donald Trump has been the beneficiary of that polemical, mean-spirited, hard, untruthful side of the world. And maybe everybody has some of that in them. Maybe there's a little yin and yang in all of us, but there's this dark fascination with some of the worst parts of our character. And certainly Trump has exploited that.
But it sounds like you're putting most of the blame on media. Let me give you a couple of examples if I could. We had a cabinet minister at one point in time who went to London and I think ordered a $24 orange juice and was almost forced to resign over that. And yet, you know, Trump is getting jets given to him, and I was in Florida recently talking to really nice, smart, capable people that thought that was completely okay. We've got a situation where I think we've had two or three prime ministers that haven't been willing to spend the money to fix up 24 Sussex, and yet we've got Trump building the biggest expansion ever of the White House and people support of that. So what has happened in this world?
I think I don't know the answer to all of these questions. There's no question he gets away with things you never could have got away with before. I mean, it was a scandal with women, his misogynist. That would have destroyed anybody in my generation.
Didn't
But
John Turner get, like for patting someone's rear?
Iona Campanola, he patted her rear, and it almost cost him his career. And as you said, there was a glass of Vevoda, had a $14 glass of orange juice in a London, England hotel that almost cost her, maybe did cost her career. And the tolerance level for this was almost zero. I mean, Bill Davis, who was one of my predecessors, I don't think he committed any sins his whole life. And, he was a moderate man in all things. Bill used to say moderation in all things. I mean,
My second cousin Bob Nixon would disagree with you on that, particularly in regards
Nixon
to.
has a different view with him, but he would roll over in his grave to see what people get away with today. But again, the question is why? And I think this explosion, I don't blame the media. The media respect runs where there is a market. And if the market um, buys this stuff and it buys these extreme points of view, and it has been a diminution of conventional media. What conventional media does or did, and I take the big newspapers or the networks, they curated the news. They aspired to tell the truth. They created common kinds of truths that we could discuss. They didn't make up things for the sake of making up things. And there's so many sources of news today that make up things just because it will sell. And it's a troubling world to grow up in, and troubling world to disseminate information. The hardest thing in the information age is to convey information.
One of the other things I wanted to ask you about was charisma. Lots of people said you had tons of charisma. I had the privilege of walking door to door with you in I think it was the 1981 election. And, you were just unbelievable at the door. Where does charisma come from?
Well, charisma, I don't even know. Charisma, I, let me tell you this, Brian. You have a lot more charisma when you've got the title. When you win, you've got charisma. When I was losing, I didn't have that much charisma. It's just like when I told jokes when I was premier, I was really funny. And if I told the same joke when I was leader of the opposition, I wasn't nearly as funny. And so, power creates charisma and creates its own force field around it. But a lot of charisma is energy, caring about other people, not being self-possessed or self-focused. And it is a generosity about life. And it's making other people feel good. Some people can walk through a room and make other people feel good. a lot of it you go through a room is it's the eye contact, and you learn to give people a little bit of your time, and it's a sincere thing. It's not an insincere thing. It's rooted in a genuine like of other people.
You also attracted an incredible amount of loyalty, people that have stuck with you over the years. And I think during your leadership and premiership, and even thereafter, people that were incredibly connected to you and loyal to you. How do you create that?
Geez, you're being very complimentary. I'm not sure I'm very good at any of these things, but I was blessed that I had, and I will say at this point in time, to this point in history, the finest cabinet ever assembled in the history of Ontario. I mean, they were really bright people, like Uncle Bob, and like Ian Scott and Sean Conway, and a lot of other. Not everybody was perfect, but boy, there was a core of really, really competent people. And how and I was the orchestra conductor. I had to work with all of them and get them all functioning at a high level. And part of doing that is trusting them and working with them and building and making it about let them build their own profile, not step in their way every time they're doing something. And I think I think in business, Brian, and I was in business before I got into politics. You have to build other people. You have to let them shine. You have to give them credit, and you have to encourage them to disagree with you and reward them when they do disagree with you. If you're too arrogant, if you think you know all the answers, then people will shut down and won't help you. And when you say, hey, you disagree with me, you know what? You were right. I was wrong. People then are comfortable working together. And I would say to you, without exception, 5 smart people are a hell of a lot smarter than one smart person. And the real genius in leadership is getting them all working at a very high capacity for whatever the results you want to achieve.
One of the other things I've noticed about you, sir, is that even after politics, you stayed very connected to people and you helped them out. You may remember that you gave me a very strong recommendation to one job that was very influential in my career. And I've heard from other people when I've commented about that, that you did the same thing for them. Why'd you do that? And why do you think it's important in life?
Brian, I've had my successes in life and I've had my failures in life. And don't forget, you've been too gentlemanly to go there. I presided over quite a spectacular defeat um, at, at at the end of all this, and lots of decisions were made, and it was my responsibility. But I do know that everybody in life goes through ups and downs. And they go through ups and downs in their lives, in their businesses, in their marriages, and their emotional state. And I always tried to be sensitive to people that were down. And if someone is down, I'd phone them and take them for lunch. When you're top of the pile, you have more friends than you need. When you're at the bottom of the pile, that's when you need friends. And so that's when I would phone somebody and say, let's go for lunch, or try to be sensitive to what they're going through in their own life. And I know lots of people have been very nice to me at various times in my life when it was important to me, and I try to do the same.
I think that your comments about idealism, about leadership, about um, 5 smart people is better than one smart person. I think about charisma, which you modestly didn't agree you have, but I think you have it in spades. And your networking, building community, building people up, reaching out to people when they're down, I think are some incredible traits that I think you're a great example of. And thank you for the role that you played in my life in that regard. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, I'm going to ask David Peterson about national unity, because that's one of the issues that he was really focused on during his tenure, and we're going through that all over again. And so I'd like to hear what he's got to say about it. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes with the 20th Premier of Ontario, David Peterson. Stay with us. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've got David Peterson with us tonight. He is the 20th Premier of Ontario. He was elected in 1985, 40 years ago. And Mr. Peterson, one of the things that you were really focused on was national unity, and you worked closely with a conservative prime minister at the time, I believe, Brian Mulroney, to work hard. And some of it succeeded, and frankly, some of it didn't. This past weekend, there was an article in the paper that said Canada works best when the Ontario Premier and the Canadian Prime Minister of different parties, but also are good friends and work well together. Up until probably December or January of this year, it looked like the Parti Québécois would win the next election in Quebec, and the Bloc Québécois would potentially be the official opposition in Canada if there was an election in December. That's changed a little bit given what's happened, but it's interesting that there was such a positive movement prior to Donald Trump and to Mark Carney to Quebec separation, and now there's this big movement in Alberta about potential separation, and the list of 12 things that the Premier of Alberta says that need to happen. Otherwise, there's going to be problems in Alberta, and actually probably a referendum for separation. Tell me how you feel about Canada today and about national unity, and if you sat down with our premiers or our premier or our prime minister, what advice would you give them? What would you tell them?
Brian, boy, these are big, big, big questions. But let me start off by saying that I was preoccupied with national unity. And I'd spent a lot of my time, when I was a young man, going back to when I was in law school. I studied in Quebec. I spent twice I studied in Quebec. I was a student of the separatist movement. You recall the Révolution Tranquille in the late 50s and the 60s. They're blowing up the separatist movement. They're blowing up mailboxes and leading to the separatist government being elected, when a very great threat to our confederation. Now, I believed, as the Premier of the province of Ontario, one of my greatest responsibilities was to build national unity. This is a very unique federation that we live in. It's the only federation in the world. Canada is arguably the most decentralized federation in the world, country in the world.
Decentralized, really, even more than the United States, where they talk about states' rights, states' rights.
Way more than the United States. It's almost the same level as the premiers of provinces have way more power than governors have. Inside with bigger budgets relative to their populations and far more power over a lot more constitutionally. It's relatively the same as Switzerland, which is highly decentralized. The other unique piece of Canada is that Ontario is it's the only country in the world where one piece, i.e. Ontario, represents, depending on how you measure it, 35 to 40% of everything that goes on in the country. Now, there's the biggest, toughest member of the Federation. Don't forget, we have another province on Prince Edward Island with 120,000 people. It's about the size of Sarnia. You think about it, and yet in some ways you're a constitutional equal. This was the nature of our country. So I did know something about the history of the country. I worked very hard to build an axis between Quebec City, Robert Bourassa was a great friend of mine, and Brian Mulroney, because that axis really keeps the country together. Now, you've got to keep an eye on the West, and I worked very hard with Don Getty and Bill Vanderzem and others on the West. And it was at a different stage in the march towards the perfect union. than it is today. But in my day, I had to do everything I could to keep this country. And don't forget, we almost lost the country. Don't forget, and Brian, I could speak for hours on this because I do lecture in constitutional history. But in 1982, when Trudeau patriated the Constitution, Quebec was left out. To that day, that is a scar in the minds of many, many people in Quebec. And Beach Lake was about trying to put that all together and make the Confederation whole. So I spent an awful lot of time building relationships with my peers, with the guys on the Grant Devines of the world, but also the Don Getty, who was a premier, and Peter Lougheed, who was a great friend of mine in Alberta, and trying to keep the Confederation whole. And I also knew when you're the biggest, richest member of this Confederation, as we were, you had to put up with more. And you had to let the other guys squawk or complain or say they were getting a bad deal and help them get a good deal. So I had very close relationships with my peers, with Frank McKenna and a lot of others across the country. And I worked at that because this is, Brian, I get up every morning and I kiss the ground. And I say, we are lucky to be Canadian. And just if you don't believe me, just look south of the border and say, how would you like to be living down there? But we have a history of compromise and accommodation that we must guard and protect. All of us must.
Do we still have that? I've heard from lots of people that are either current or former politicians that what you've just described, and maybe Doug Ford and Mark Carney are the exception to the rule, but that it's very difficult to have friends across the aisle today. I've heard from MPs that they used to go for dinner, they used to have drinks, they used to be friendly with, they used to work on bills together with people from other parties, and today that's impossible. What's your sense? Is that kind of camaraderie and friendship and cooperation possible today?
Look, it was always a competitive world. And I wasn't a close friend of Bill. I was a great admirer of John Robarts, who was the predecessor of, and I was from London like he was, and he was a friend of mine and almost a mentor to me. And he didn't support me, but he didn't criticize. He was very, very accommodating to my aspirations and told people I was the kind of guy that should be in politics. So it's competitive with a guy like Davis, but it was never hateful. We didn't use words like calling each other liars. We were civilized. We were the same way we'd be in a tough tennis match, and you'd shake hands at the end of the tennis match. That's not the case today, Brian.
Tell me about what you think the right political policy positioning of the Liberal Party is. You were thought of, and this may or may
And
not
you're
be
right. And
fair.
there's been a general.
Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Sorry, you've been described as sort of a fiscal conservative, as a blue liberal, and then you've got the example of Stuart Smith, who you mentioned, who was more perceived as more left wing. Certainly, Kathleen Wynne, more left wing. Mark Carney, maybe more fiscally conservative. What's the right positioning in your mind for the Liberal Party?
I'll tell you where I am, and there's two sides to government. There's number one is making sure life is fair, working to guarantee opportunity and services, being the for people, being the voice for people that don't have a voice on their own, that are trampled by the big interests in life, like big business or big labor. And that is a very important part of building that opportunity, whether it's pharmacare or whether it's coming out against discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or ethnocultural background or anything else. That's a really important part of the liberal agenda. I am very much a social liberal. Now, The other half of the job is creating wealth and help people have money and the state have money to do the things that I talked about in the first instance. You can't deny or neglect the money making part or the fiscal part of your responsibilities. So, and this goes back to the great trade debates we have, which we can talk about, Brian, but we had a view that Ontario had to be a knowledge based technological leader and trade with the globe and be a global player. And we were an important part of that discussion in our days. So, what I'm saying to me, a liberal is, I'm a social liberal, fiscal, fiscally responsible. Now, then you say, well, what about deficit? We didn't, Bill Davis never balanced a budget. We hadn't been a budget balance in Ontario in 14 years when we came in. We did. Why do I say that? It's a moral thing to me. I don't have a right to go and spend money and expect my kids to pay it back any more than I have a moral right to go and make a mess, i.e., pollute, and expect the next generation to clean up my mess. It's the morality of politics, the morality that says we look after ourselves, we invest for our children. We don't expect our children to invest for us. I do not believe in intergenerational transfers of wealth. I don't believe that I have a right to live on the backs of my children's capacity to produce goods and services or wealth. That's a it begins with a morality, but that's where I believe the Liberal Party has to be. And so I think, I'm very fond of Justin in so many ways, but I think he lost control of that side of the Liberal leadership responsibility.
You mentioned trade. If you had a chance, and you probably had that chance, but if you had a chance to talk to Mark Carney or to Doug Ford, our Prime Minister and our Premier, what would you tell them? What advice would you provide them, sir?
Look, I can't imagine a bigger set of problems than Mark Carney has right now. When you're dealing with the most important person on earth who functions on a whim, you can't take one thing that he says at face value. You don't get the impression he's ever read a book or studied any issue and will change his mind. This is, again, you're the media. You explain why you got elected. That's your problem, Brian. But let me
He went on
say,
a podcast like you are.
and let me say, I can't imagine a more complicated job than Mark's got. And I give Doug Ford credit for not for trying to be helpful. Doug isn't encumbered by philosophy particularly. That's not where he comes from, but he's got common sense. We have a tremendous amount at stake in Ontario in these conversations, and I think he is trying to be supportive. Whether I would say all the things that he says or not's another story, but I think they're coming at it the right way. At the end of the day, you can only have one mastermind on this. I think if Carney wasn't there, if Mark wasn't there, and I go back 6 months, Brian, and how this world has changed. You talked about this when Pierre Poilievre was going to be the prime minister and Mark Carney wasn't even on the scene. I mean, there's been so many changes in the last 6 months. But this country, given the crisis it was in with Trump and others, and they put out a job search for somebody who's the most qualified person to get us out of this mess, probably they would have hired Mark Carney. We're lucky the guy came along. That's not to say he's guaranteed success, because he isn't. It's enormously complicated what he's doing. I think he's shown a maturity, a restraint, and judgment. Sometimes you give, sometimes you don't. Sometimes you have to work with what you've got. You've got to wait some things out. You've got to be patient. And no matter what you do, it's not going to be perfect. But I say this in all sincerity, can you imagine Pierre Polyev doing this?
I can't. And just
I can't imagine. And I'm not being a partisan now. And I am glad that Doug Ford is being, I think, really in his own way, trying very hard to be constructive. I think he very much politically played this whole thing to his advantage. I guess you can't be critical of that, but you've got to make sure there isn't so much bluster you talk yourself into trouble.
well,
But his advisor will be telling him things.
I just think logistically, within the first month or 2 months of taking over, if you've got to do a throne speech, you got to do an Oval Office visit, you've got to host the G7, you've got to go to a NATO conference. That's going to be a pretty challenging agenda for like if you like it would have been challenging. I think highly of you, but that would have been challenging for you, wouldn't it?
It was, Brian, it's a huge agenda, and I give them very high marks. And we do know that the country's been drawn together in a lot of ways over this thing. Uh, and people want the best. I think we've seen a lot of the best in this country, and we've seen the separatism subside. In Quebec, to some extent, it was really quite rampant 6 months ago, and then we're seeing this heavy pressure coming from Alberta. So the center of gravity is switching in the country a lot, and I think the number one priority for a prime minister is national unity. I think he is playing a balancing game about as well as you can. That's not to say it's going to turn out for sure tomorrow or the next day.
We're going to take a final break and come back with one last question for David Peterson in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everyone. Back with one last question. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. It's a real honor for me to be chatting tonight with David Peterson. He's the 20th Premier of Ontario. I had the privilege of working closely with him back 40 years ago. Actually, no, it was, I guess, 50 years ago or 45 years ago, I guess it was, when I had the privilege of working with you. I think that a lot of the things that we talked about is your ability to connect with people, your leadership, your charisma, the ability for you to help people out. Are traits that I admire and that I've tried to emulate, sir. I got to ask you about one other.
Yeah.
You've had an incredibly successful marriage. What's the secret, sir, to a successful marriage?
Oh man, I met Shelley on the stage. I saw her on the stage. I used to go to the theater. I arranged to meet her. I took her out for lunch. I fell in love over soup. Fell head over heels, and we got married 2.5 months later. Now, if my kids did that, Brian, I'd think they were nuts, and I would tell them not to do it. And so I got enormously lucky, and you know her, and she's magic. There are a few little things that I would say, apart from her wonderful character. She's very lovable, so it's easy to love her. But I would say talk a lot. Just talk. We talk about every damn thing you can possibly. Most of it isn't very serious, but then there's serious stuff too about whether it's philosophy, politics, or kids, or dogs, cats, rats. But number two, we have similar values. Kids were very important to us. We have 3 kids that we adore, and we have 7 grandchildren. A very, very important part of our life. And she's a wonderful, loving mother. The other thing, and our kids, apart from work, kids were the center of our life. I mean, I didn't go and play golf with the boys. It was when we had young kids. I was working, or we were playing whatever the kids did, ride bikes, play soccer, whatever. And the other, uh, uh, I think it's staying grounded and staying in touch and supporting the other person. She would not have picked politics, but she was actually would have much preferred I hadn't. But when I decided to do it, she was there 100 steps of the way. She's a very accomplished person in her own way. She was an actress, she's an author, and I supported everything she did. And she would go and do plays when we had kids.
Hello, are you there?
Hello, yeah, I'm here. Did we lose you?
No, I'm here.
But I can't see you anymore. But she would go do a play. So everything she wanted to do to help her be fulfilled. I encouraged her, and she encouraged me. And I think encouraging people to do what they need to do is a very important part of building a constructive marriage.
David Peterson, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it. This has been a wonderful
Brian, I'm
conversation.
very fond of you. You're a very important part of our life, and thank you for inviting me.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining. I remind you on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock. You know, I wanted to chat with David Peterson, number one, because it's the 40th anniversary of his election as Premier of Ontario. He's got some great lessons, and I think that you know, emulating him and copying him and following his example are something that I've tried to do, and lots of people would be better off if they tried to do. But also, I think that putting into perspective leadership is critically important as the Ontario Liberal Party gets together for this upcoming convention and thinking about leadership. And so David's a great example of an excellent leader. And so thank you, David Peterson, for the role you've played in Ontario, the role you've played in Canada, the role you've played in the Liberal Party, the role you've played in my life. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, and best wishes to you, Brian.